The year is 1956. The location is the pristine, white slopes of Engelberg, Switzerland. A 12-year-old boy named Rolf is on a ski vacation, a rare moment of luxury in a Europe still dusting itself off from the rubble of total war. He is accompanied by a man introduced to him simply as Uncle Fritz. To the child, Fritz is a distant, unsettling figure, rigid, formal, and profoundly uncomfortable with the chaotic, unscripted joy of children. They share meals in heavy silence, the clink of silverware against porcelain, the only bridge between them. They walk through the deep, crystalline snow, leaving two distinct sets of tracks that never quite converge. The boy feels a chill that has nothing to do with the biting winter air. He senses a void in this man, a profound lack of warmth that feels like an emotional vacuum. What Rolf does not know, and what he will not be told for another 4 years, is that the man struggling with stiff fingers to zip up his winter coat is not an uncle. He is his father. He is Rolf Mengele, the doctor of Auschwitz, the man the world knows as the Angel of Death. This meeting was not a desperate, clandestine encounter in a dark, rain-slicked alley. It was a vacation. It was a meticulously orchestrated family gathering held at a popular resort, surrounded by unsuspecting tourists and the serene beauty of the Alps. It was arranged by one of the wealthiest industrial families in Bavaria, a clan whose influence reached deep into the bedrock of the German economy. This image, a mass murderer, a man responsible for some of the most heinous crimes in human history, skiing freely in Switzerland while the Mossad and international intelligence agencies hunted his ghost, encapsulates the terrifying, surreal reality of post-war Europe. It was not a story of a brilliant escape or a genius of disguise. It was a story of systemic protection, of a man shielded not by shadows, but by the blinding light of wealth and social status. To understand how Rolf Mengele survived for 30 years after the collapse of the Third Reich, one must look away from the humid, dense jungles of South America and look instead at the quaint, industrious town of Günzburg, Germany. Here, the name Mengele did not evoke the stench of burning flesh, the barking of dogs, or the horrific selection ramps of Poland. It evoked pride. It meant stability. It meant the very survival of the community. The Mengele family owned Mengele Agrartechnik, a behemoth in the manufacturing of farm machinery, threshers, balers, combines. If you were a farmer in Europe in the 1950s, trying to feed a starving continent, the machine that harvested your grain likely bore the name Mengele, stamped in heavy, unforgiving steel. In Günzburg, the family were not pariahs. They were the largest employers, the patrons of the arts, and the architects of the local economy. They were the heartbeat of the region. This created a profound moral schizophrenia that defined the era. Outside of this small Bavarian town, survivors of Auschwitz were waking up screaming from nightmares about the man who whistled Wagner and Mozart while casually flicking his wrist to condemn thousands to the gas chambers. Inside the town, the Mengele family sat at polished dinner tables, respected, secure, and untouchable. They knew exactly where Joseph was. They did not abandon him to the judgment of the world or the ropes of the gallows. Instead, they built a fortress of money and a wall of silence around him. This was not a passive silence. It was an active, logistical operation. The family viewed Joseph not as a monster to be purged, but as a strayed son to be managed. They treated his exile as a complicated business problem, a line item in the family ledger that required discretion and consistent funding. The mechanism of this protection was precise, bureaucratic, and chillingly banal. The family did not send suitcases of cash across borders in the dead of night, like a scene from a spy novel. Instead, they utilized a trusted, long-term employee, a man named Hans Sedlmayr. For decades, Sedlmayr acted as the courier, the single, unbreakable thread connecting the fugitive in South America to the family fortune in Bavaria. Every month, with the regularity of a clockwork mechanism, a stipend was transferred. 100 to 175 United States dollars. It seems a modest, almost trivial sum now. But in the volatile economies of Argentina, Paraguay, and later Brazil, it ensured that the most wanted Nazi on earth never had to work a day in his life. He never had to expose himself to the public eye in a factory or a shop. He never went hungry. The family managed these transfers with the same cold efficiency they applied to the production lines of their tractors. There were no paper trails that led back to the corporate headquarters. No mistakes were made. They understood that to protect their blood was to commit a crime against humanity. But in their insular, dynastic worldview, the greater crime would be disloyalty to the family name. Money was the fuel, but the engine of this conspiracy was a dark form of emotional and social manipulation. In 1954, Joseph's first wife, Irene, divorced him. To the public, it appeared as a clean break, a moral rejection of his crimes by a woman who wanted no part of his legacy. In reality, it was a tactical maneuver of the highest order It allowed Irene to return to a normal, prosperous life in Germany, effectively deflecting suspicion and providing a shield for their son, Rolf. While Joseph remained hidden and funded, the family then leaned into something almost archaic, a twisted form of dynastic preservation reminiscent of royal houses. Joseph's younger brother, Karl Jr., had died young, leaving behind a widow named Martha. In 1958, the family arranged for Martha to travel to South America. She did not go merely to visit or to offer condolences. She went to marry Joseph. Consider the harrowing psychology of this union. A woman travels across an ocean to marry her dead husband's brother, a man she knows is a fugitive mass murderer, the architect of unspeakable suffering. They lived together in Argentina, and later, briefly, in Paraguay, in a grotesque, sun-drenched parody of domestic normalcy. Martha cooked meals for the angel of death. She folded his laundry. She provided him with a facade of humanity that he had long ago forfeited. This was not a marriage of love or passion. It was a marriage of containment. It ensured that Joseph remained anchored to the family, that his volatile ego remained satisfied, and that his secrets remained locked within the circle of blood. Martha was his jailer as much as his wife, ensuring the family's investment in his silence remained secure. Meanwhile, back in Germany, the boy from the ski slopes, Rolf, was growing up in a world of shadows. At 16, the weight of the secrets became too much for the family to bear, and his mother finally sat him down to dismantle the lie. Uncle Fritz was his father. The weight of this revelation is difficult to quantify for a modern mind. Rolf was a child of the post-war generation, a generation taught in schools to despise the Nazis, to see them as the ultimate manifestation of human depravity. Now, he found that the very archetype of that evil was his own flesh and blood. His DNA was a map of Auschwitz. He spent his youth trying to reconcile the rigid, awkward man in the Swiss snow with the monster of history. Rolf studied law, perhaps in a subconscious attempt to find a sense of justice or order that his family had so thoroughly subverted. He changed his surname to his wife's name, a desperate act of erasure to shield his own children from the stain. He tried to build a life of clinical sterility, far removed from the dirt and blood of the past. But the question remained, gnawing at his conscience. Who was this man? Was he the demonic figure of the history books? Or was he merely the pathetic, aging stranger he had seen in the mountains? The cognitive dissonance was a burden he carried into every courtroom and every family gathering. In 1977, Rolf made a decision that few human beings could summon the courage to execute. Driven by a desperate need for closure, or perhaps a final hope for a shred of humanity, he flew to Brazil. He traveled to the gritty, dusty outskirts of São Paulo to confront his father. He did not find a powerful Nazi officer or a defiant ideologue. He found a broken, hollow man. Joseph was 67 years old, living under the alias Wolfgang Gerhard. He was bitter, paranoid, and consumed by a nauseating level of self-pity. He lived in a modest house, complaining about the heat, the food, and the unfairness of his exile. Rolf did not go there for a reunion. He did not go to hug his father or seek a blessing. He went there to interrogate the ghost that had haunted his life. For days, the son pressed the father in the stifling Brazilian heat. He asked about the camps. He asked about the children, the twins, the horrific medical experiments conducted without anesthesia. He asked about the selections on the ramp, where a flick of a finger decided who lived for an hour and who lived for a day. Rolf was desperate for a sign of remorse, a single crack in the psychological armor, a tear of guilt that might allow him to reconcile his own existence with his father's crimes. He wanted to see a human being behind the monster. He found nothing. Rolf Mengele looked his son in the eye with a terrifying, flat gaze and claimed he had never personally harmed anyone. He spoke of duty. He spoke of scientific necessity. He spoke of the burden of following orders in a time of total war. He had compartmentalized his atrocities so completely that in his own twisted mind, he was the primary victim, a victim of a lost war, a victim of circumstance, and a victim of a world that was too small-minded to understand his genius. He showed no more emotion for the victims of Auschwitz than a mechanic might show for a discarded part. Rolf realized then that the man before him was not just unrepentant, he was incapable of guilt. The fundamental moral machinery that makes us human was simply missing, replaced by a cold, intellectual vacuum. Rolf returned to Germany with his answer, but he also returned with a terrible, heavy silence. He did not go to the police. He did not call the international press or the hunters of the Mossad. Even facing the undeniable reality of his father's absolute evil, the primal bond of family held firm. He could not bring himself to be the one to tighten the noose. He kept the secret. He allowed the monster to continue sitting in the sun in Brazil, protected by the silence of the son who despised him. It was a final, tragic victory for the Mengele family's policy of loyalty over justice. 2 years later, in 1979, the end finally came. It did not come by a judge's gavel, an assassin's bullet, or a hangman's rope. It came by water. Joseph Mengele went for a swim at Bertioga Beach. While in the water, he suffered a stroke, a mundane, biological failure for a man who had caused so much physical trauma to others. He drowned in the surf. A small, inconsequential death for a man of such monumental cruelty. He was buried in a quiet grave under his false name, Wolfgang Gerhard. The family in Günzburg received the news almost immediately through their established channels. They did not notify the West German authorities. They did not contact the Red Cross or the Israeli government to correct the historical record. For 6 long years, the world continued to hunt a dead man. Intelligence agencies chased phantoms through the forests of Paraguay and the alleys of Buenos Aires, spending millions of dollars and countless hours of manpower, while the Mengele family sat in their comfortable homes in Bavaria, knowing exactly where he was. They knew he was already rotting in a Brazilian grave. They had protected him in life, and with a cold, calculating devotion, they protected his myth in death. They allowed the world to remain in a state of terror and uncertainty, preferring that the victims never find peace if it meant protecting the family's privacy. It was not until 1985, under a crushing wave of international pressure and renewed forensic interest, that the family finally broke. The wall of silence began to crumble as the older generation passed away and the legal net tightened. They produced the letters, the meticulously kept diaries, and the dental records they had held for years. The remains in Brazil were exhumed. Forensic experts from across the globe gathered around a skeleton, and the confirmation was final. The hunt was over. The angel of death was truly gone. But the story ends with a final, bitter paradox that serves as a stinging indictment of post-war justice. When the truth finally emerged, when the sheer extent of the family's financial, logistical, and emotional support was revealed, the public expected a reckoning. They expected the family matriarchs and the corporate directors to be dragged into court for harboring a war criminal and obstructing justice for decades. They expected the law to finally speak for the millions who had no voice. It never happened. West German law contained a specific, archaic legal provision known as Angehörigenprivileg, times the privilege of family members. This law stated that a citizen could not be compelled to incriminate their close relatives, nor could they be prosecuted for helping a family member evade the law. It was a legal recognition that the bond of blood is considered, in the eyes of the state, stronger than the obligation to the abstract concept of justice. Therefore, funding a fugitive mass murderer, arranging his marriages, and hiding his death for years was not punishable as a crime. The Mengele family had sustained a monster for 34 years. They had deceived the world. They had denied even the smallest shred of closure to thousands of survivors. And because of this law, they had committed no legal offense. They walked free, their fortune intact, their social standing in Günzburg largely undisturbed. In the decades that followed, the company, Mengele Agrartechnik, began a slow, inevitable decline. It was no longer the symbol of German efficiency it once was. It was eventually bailed out by taxpayer money, then sold off in pieces, and finally dismantled. Today, the name Mengele has been largely scrubbed from the machinery of European agriculture. The tractors are gone. The factory is a memory. The family's industrial empire has evaporated into the history of the 20th century. But the lesson of the shadows remains, darker and more persistent than the name on a machine. We like to believe that evil is a solitary force, that monsters like Joseph Mengele act alone in the dark. The story of his survival proves the opposite. Evil requires an infrastructure to survive. It requires a steady stream of money. It requires a courier willing to carry letters across oceans. It requires a lawyer to find the right loopholes. And most of all, it requires a family, a group of people willing to sit in a room, look at a stranger in the snow, and choose the preservation of their own blood over the shared humanity of the world. The real horror of the Mengele story isn't just what happened at the camp. It's the 30 years of quiet, comfortable life that followed, paid for by the silence of those who claimed to be just family. The silence of the Mengele family is the echo that still haunts the pristine slopes of Switzerland and the dusty streets of Brazil, a reminder that the most dangerous protection is the kind that comes from the people who know us best. Would you like me to analyze the historical context of the times, Angehörigenprivileg times law further? Or perhaps focus on another figure from the post-war era?